This video contains graphic content and disturbing themes related to real-life events involving murder and psychological trauma. Viewer discretion is advised.
The Carlsbad woman doesn't want Michael or Susan Carson to ever be released from prison.
10 News reporter Steve Fiorina is joining us. And Steve, even the killer's own daughter wants him to stay locked up.
She still fears her father more than 30 years after the murders of 3 people, at least here in California. 1 hit over the head with a frying pan, 2 were shot, and they used a knife on all 3 of them.
You never expect to find darkness hiding in the everyday. Yet, that's exactly what happened when Jennifer Carson realized her father, once her protector, had become a monster in disguise. In the 1980s, her life would shatter when the man she loved and trusted, Michael Carson, was revealed to be part of a killing spree that seemed to have no end. Imagine for a moment, standing in the midst of your childhood home, thinking you know your father, only to learn that the same hands that rocked you to sleep had killed. It was then, standing in that painful intersection of love and betrayal, that Jennifer Carson had to face the horrific truth. Her father was not just a criminal, he was a killer. Before the murders began, Michael and Susan Carson were a different kind of family. A seemingly ordinary family living on the outskirts of San Francisco, their lives tangled in a world of mysticism, drugs, and delusion. It was the 1970s, a time when free love and exploration were on the rise. But for Michael and Susan, it quickly morphed into an obsession. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more gripping stories. By 1981, Jennifer had already witnessed the cracks in her father's behavior. After her parents' divorce, her father remarried a woman who, in Jennifer's eyes, was no more than a stranger wrapped in strange rituals and paranoid beliefs. Her stepmother, Susan, believed she was a psychic. And not just any psychic, but a self-proclaimed prophet, one whose visions and delusions led to violence, and ultimately, death.
Mayor.
You can fool your father, but I know you're the devil, and I'm going to get this demon out of you.
The more Jennifer watched, the more it became clear. Her father's addiction to psychedelic drugs had clouded his judgment, while Susan's grasp on reality became progressively weaker. The couple didn't just believe in witchcraft, they thought they had been chosen to rid the world of witches, and they were ready to kill anyone they deemed a threat. March 1981. San Francisco. The landlord entered the basement apartment, expecting nothing more than a standard maintenance visit. What he found was anything but ordinary. The apartment, rented by 23-year-old Karen Barnes, was a portrait of chilling stillness. The walls, once white, were now adorned with symbols, cryptic messages, and the word Susan painted in eerie strokes. The air was thick with an unsettling tension, as if the apartment itself knew something dreadful had taken place. Then, they found her. Karen's body, face down in a pool of blood, was unrecognizable. 13 stab wounds, each one deeply carved into her head and neck, told a story of brutal violence. The force of the attack had shattered her skull. She was wrapped in a blanket, as if her body had been discarded like a forgotten object, her life snuffed out by the very people who had once been her companions. As investigators entered the room, the sight left them speechless. The room wasn't just a crime scene, it was a twisted reflection of the twisted minds of the Carsons. It was clear that Karen had been killed with a purpose, a purposeful, calculated violence. The discovery of Karen's body, coupled with the strange symbols surrounding her, pointed directly to Michael and Susan Carson. But they were gone. Their trail was cold. The only clues left were the objects they'd carelessly abandoned in their flight. And among them was a manifesto, a document outlining their delusions, detailing a crusade against those they deemed witches, and strangely, including names like Ronald Reagan and Johnny Carson.
This manifesto called A Cry for War.
It calls for nuclear war, targeted bombings, political assassination.
There was detailed plans to kill witches, and they had a list of the witches.
The search for Michael and Susan Carson would lead investigators to the dark, isolated corners of California. In 1982, they found themselves in the town of Alder Point, working on a marijuana farm. But this wasn't a peaceful retreat. It was a battleground where delusions ruled. The couple, self-proclaimed soldiers in a war against witches, were already deep into their own fabricated world. They were convinced that the apocalypse was near, and that their role was to cleanse the world of witches, using whatever means necessary. It was here that tragedy struck again. A worker at the farm, Clark Stevens, had a dispute with the Carsons over how to properly maintain the crops. It started as a petty argument about work. But in the fevered minds of Michael and Susan, it was enough to mark Clark as a witch, someone who threatened their mission. They decided Clark had to die. And so they killed him, shooting him, setting his body on fire, and burying it beneath manure. When a group of campers stumbled upon a disturbing sight, Clark's skull, only then did the investigators begin to piece together the Carsons' horrifying pattern. Yet, the Carsons managed to evade capture, until one fateful day, their obsession with eliminating witches would finally catch up with them. On January 1983, Michael and Susan Carson continued their cross-country journey, their minds tangled in delusions and paranoid beliefs. They didn't plan their route, they simply wandered, driven by a warped sense of purpose. This time, they found themselves on the side of US Route 101, the long stretch of road that cuts through the Golden State. They hitched a ride with a man named John Hellier, who had no way of knowing that his act of kindness would be the last thing he'd ever do. The truck was filled with the hum of the engine, the kind of steady noise that so often blends into the background of everyday life. But in the cab of that truck, everything was about to change. As the miles stretched on, the uneasy silence between John, Michael, and Susan grew heavier. Susan, who believed she had been wronged by the world at large, began to feel a growing sense of discomfort. The truck driver's casual touch on her leg, something as innocent as that, set off a torrent of irrational fury in her mind. She saw it as a sign, a violation, the kind of thing that demanded retribution. It was then that the violence began. John, realizing something wasn't right, attempted to make light of the situation. But the Carsons weren't interested in rationality or kindness. Michael, eyes glazed with the influence of drugs and delusion, grabbed for his weapon, while Susan, filled with purpose, pulled out a knife. The truck swerved as Michael struggled with John, both men fighting for control, but it was Susan who struck the first blow. The sharp sound of the knife cutting through flesh pierced the air, followed by the chaos of the ensuing struggle. The truck came to a halt, tires screeching against the asphalt as John fought for his life. His scream was muffled by the wind and the distant hum of passing vehicles. The struggle outside the vehicle was a horrific scene, each second feeling drawn out, as if time itself slowed in the face of violence. In a final brutal moment, Michael overpowered John, the weapon in his hand ending the truck driver's life. The blood-stained truck became a mobile tomb, a place where a stranger's kindness met a brutal end. But the Carsons didn't flee in fear. No, they simply drove off, as though nothing had happened. They left the lifeless body of John Hellier behind, his blood staining the earth, while they vanished into the night. As they sped away, they knew that the world would soon be searching for them. But it didn't matter to them. They had their purpose. They had their mission. It wasn't long before the chase began. A high-speed pursuit, filled with the wail of sirens and the screeching of tires, echoed through the roads of California. The Carsons, who had once walked among us as ordinary people, were now hunted criminals. Their latest act of violence had caught the attention of witnesses, and the authorities weren't far behind. The Carsons, frantic and filled with a strange sense of superiority, attempted to outrun the law. But the roads, which they had so casually traveled on, now felt like a trap. Each turn seemed to tighten the noose around their necks. But they were determined. They weren't going to give up. Not yet. As their stolen truck swerved through the winding roads, the police were gaining on them. Their delusions seemed to fuel their resolve. Each second spent speeding away from justice only deepened their belief in their divine mission. They didn't see themselves as criminals. No, they were heroes in their minds, fighting an invisible battle that no one else understood. And then, as fate would have it, the truck veered off the road, crashing into a ditch. The Carsons scrambled, not to escape the consequences of their actions, but to escape the end of their delusional quest. They ran into the brush, their feet crashing through the undergrowth, but the law was swift and unforgiving. The police closed in, chasing them through the thick brush. In the end, they were cornered by the authorities near a river. Michael and Susan, once so confident in their delusions, now found themselves trapped, no longer free to live in their distorted world. The arrest was almost anticlimactic. The Carsons, despite their delusions, surrendered. They were no longer in control. The reign of terror they had tried to bring to life had come to an abrupt end. As the Carsons stood trial, the courtroom was filled with a strange tension. The world, still reeling from the horrifying crimes they had committed, watched as two people who believed they were justified in their actions prepared to face the consequences. The Carsons weren't like other defendants. They weren't broken by guilt or remorse. No, they were emboldened by their twisted convictions. As the trial began, they called for a press conference. They weren't here to apologize. They weren't here to show contrition. Instead, they were eager to share their story with the world.
The couple, labeled the San Francisco Witch Killers, Michael Bear Carson and his second wife Susan, smiling as the camera rolled.
They're wicked. They're just wicked.
For them, the murder of Karen Barnes, Clark Stevens, and John Hellier wasn't a crime. It was a mission. They believed they were doing God's work, eliminating witches from the world. Susan claimed that Karen was a psychic vampire who had drained her powers, and Clark was a demon. John, in their eyes, was a witch who needed to be punished for touching Susan's leg. Each justification, more bizarre than the last, made the courtroom shiver with disbelief. The couple smiled throughout the press conference, almost reveling in the attention. They didn't seem to care that the families of their victims were devastated by their actions. For them, this was their moment to tell the world their truth, even if it was a truth that no one could understand. But as the trial continued, it became clear that the Carsons weren't just mentally unstable. They were dangerous. The evidence against them was overwhelming, but it didn't seem to faze them. They spoke of their beliefs, their mission, and their delusions with a sense of pride. They believed they had the right to act as judge, jury, and executioner in their warped worldview. And yet, despite everything, despite the horrors they had committed, there was no sign of remorse. There was no apology. Just a cold, detached belief that they were somehow justified. The verdict was inevitable. Michael and Susan Carson were convicted of 3 murders, sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But for Jennifer Carson, the daughter who had been left behind in the wake of their destruction, the trial was just another chapter in a life that had been irrevocably altered. The trial had ended, but for Jennifer, it was as if it never truly stopped. The haunting weight of her parents' actions lingered, a shadow that stretched across her entire life. The image of her father, the man who once braided her hair and read her bedtime stories, was forever changed in her mind. What she once remembered as the warmth of his embrace now seemed like a memory from another life, a life that had died long before the murders. At just 9 years old, Jennifer was thrust into a world she couldn't begin to comprehend. The love she had for her father, so deep and unwavering, now collided with the brutal truth that he was a killer, a man who had taken lives. The confusion, the betrayal, and the overwhelming fear gripped her heart, never letting go. The image of her father's face, his cold, uncaring eyes as he spoke of his twisted justifications, played over and over in her mind. The words he had spoken during the press conference echoed in her ears, reminding her that this man, her father, had believed in a delusion. He had justified his crimes, and now she was left with the horror of knowing that the same hands that had once held her were responsible for so much suffering. But Jennifer's world was not just shaped by her father's actions. It was also shaped by the woman who had called herself her stepmother, Susan, the woman who had been both a figure of terror and authority in Jennifer's life. Susan's cruel whispers, her delusional beliefs, and the abuse Jennifer had endured were more than just memories. They were wounds, deep and festering. And when Jennifer finally made the decision to leave, To escape that nightmare, it wasn't just her father she had to leave behind. It was the twisted world they had created together. She had no choice but to run, to sever the ties that bound her to that past. But even as she fled, the memories followed her, the images of blood and violence flashing before her eyes like dark, shadowy figures that wouldn't let her go. She wasn't just escaping a physical place. She was escaping the chains of her own mind, the fear that one day, she might become like them. The thought terrified her. Could the blood that ran through her veins, his blood, be enough to make her a monster too? She didn't know, but she couldn't stay to find out. Her mother, who had once fought so hard to protect her from Michael and Susan, took her far away from their reach, hoping that in distance, they would find some kind of peace. They moved often, always staying one step ahead, living in the shadow of a world that threatened to consume them. As they settled into new places, Jennifer tried to find some semblance of normalcy. But how could she? The scars, both visible and invisible, remained. Her childhood had been stolen from her, replaced by nightmares and a lingering fear. Jennifer had always tried to love her father. But now, the man she once saw as a protector had become a symbol of terror, a monster who had taken innocent lives in cold blood. Could love survive such betrayal? Could it survive when the person you loved most turned out to be someone you could never trust? Even as the years passed, even as she grew into adulthood, Jennifer carried the weight of her past. She carried the questions that no one could answer. How had her father fallen so far from the man she once knew? Had he always been this way? Was she somehow responsible for what had happened? Her heart screamed for answers, but there were none. She would spend years searching for some form of closure, but each time she thought she was done, another piece of her past would surface, pulling her back into the nightmare. Jennifer had lived her life in pieces, trying to find a way to reconcile the love she had for her father with the monstrous actions he had taken. But the memories, the photographs, the stories, the press conferences, kept pulling her back, dragging her down into a past that she had never fully escaped. As she grew older, Jennifer made the decision to visit her father in prison. It wasn't just about closure, it was about understanding, about facing the reality that had once been so incomprehensible. She had imagined it would be a sterile encounter, a visit through glass, words spoken into a receiver, the finality of it all hitting her like a slap to the face. But when she walked into that room, everything was different. There was no glass, no barrier. Her father, Michael, was standing there, his arms wide open as though nothing had changed. As though the years, the pain, the murders, none of it mattered. In his eyes, she was still his little girl, the one he had once cared for. The moment her eyes met his, Jennifer froze. The years melted away, and all that was left was the raw, overwhelming reality of the man who had shaped her life. She had no idea what to say, no idea how to act. She was stunned, paralyzed by the emotions she had buried for so long. And for a moment, it was as if she was the child again, standing before the father she had once loved, once trusted. But then the words started flowing. Michael spoke of witches, of his delusions, his twisted beliefs, his justification for everything. He didn't see what he had done as wrong. To him, it was all part of a divine mission. He was still that man, the one who had killed without remorse, the one who believed he was acting on a higher purpose. It was at that moment that Jennifer realized something that shook her to the core. This wasn't just the father she had once known. This was a stranger. The man before her, a man filled with delusions and darkness, was not the man who had once braided her hair and told her stories. And yet, despite everything, despite the horror of his actions, Jennifer still felt something. There was still a shred of love, something deep inside her that made her want to believe that the father she had known was still in there somewhere. But it wasn't enough. It couldn't be enough. She asked him point blank about the murders. She demanded the truth, something, anything, that could bring her some peace. But what she got was more of the same. No remorse. No regret. Just a cold, detached explanation that only left her feeling emptier than before. This was her reckoning. Her father, the man who had shaped her world, would never be the man she needed him to be. The truth was simple. He had crossed a line that could never be undone. And Jennifer would never be able to fix it. She couldn't bring back the lives he had taken. She couldn't undo the pain he had caused. But at that moment, Jennifer did something that would change everything. She found her voice. She found the strength to stand up to the man who had once been her protector, but who had now become her greatest fear. As she left that prison, the weight on her shoulders seemed to lift. For the first time in years, Jennifer could breathe. She was no longer trapped by the past. She was no longer defined by her father's sins. But the scars remained. The memories lingered. And the journey to heal, if it was even possible, was just beginning. If you enjoyed this chilling case, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss any new stories. Your support helps us bring you more intense true crime content. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.